Welcome to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. The Dark Zone is happy to host The Checkpoint by USARA through this Crosspost from their feed over to ours. For episode number 6, host Brent Friedland will speak with Alan Wagner of Broad Run Off-Road Racing, followed by Stephanie Ross and Troy Farrar, as they reminisce about adventure racing national championships of the past. It's a great episode, a nice long one, and it is fuel for your nationals training. We like the work that the United States Adventure Racing Association does for its members. We're happy to support them over here on the Dark Zone. We're also happy to be the official podcast of the National Championships, and we will be on site. So sit back and relax and enjoy this Crosspost of The Checkpoint, presented by USARA.
Oh, it's a checkpoint.
Right, there's the checkpoint. Checkpoint, you better figure something out.
I think we made a mistake at the last checkpoint.
Coming to a checkpoint, sir.
Calling at the next checkpoint. Over.
Welcome to this episode of The Checkpoint, a collaboration between USARA and the Dark Zone podcast. I'm your host, Brent Friedland, and as summer starts to break a bit here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're turning our eyes to the fall season, which means USARA Nationals is just around the corner. We've got 2 great conversations for you today. First up is a quick chat with Alan Wagner, the race director for the Fall Foliage Adventure Race. Alan shares some insight into what will be the first regional qualifier for 2025 Nationals. And for all of you close enough to the Mid-Atlantic to come out, I'm sure it will be a perfect fall day. After that, we'll turn to Nationals itself. As many of you know, Michelle and Liz from Adventure Addicts Racing are organizing what I'm sure will be an incredible course this year in Snowshoe, West Virginia. In anticipation of what is shaping up to be the biggest nationals field of all time, with over 80 teams planning to attend, I reached out to Troy Farrar, founder of USARA, and Steph Ross, who's been involved with the national championship in a host of ways for well over a decade. We sit down to remember days gone by, reflect on the history of the national championship, and chat about how the event has changed, and stayed the same, over the last quarter century. As always, thanks for listening. And here's to the end of summer and some cooler autumn races ahead. Today, I'm talking to Alan Wagner, who organizes a couple of events every year for Broad Run Off-Road based in Virginia. Broad Run has been around since 2014, and Alan started organizing adventure races back in 2021. By all accounts, his events are challenging, but also fun, accessible, and creative. This October, the Fall Foliage Adventure Race is serving as Broad Run's 10th anniversary, and will also serve as the first regional qualifier for the 2025 National Championship. I'm excited to hear a bit about the event today. So, Alan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brent. I'm happy to celebrate. This is going to be 10 years since we started organizing races. We started with trail races, but now almost we're exclusively adventure races at this point.
To go off script a little bit on my end, what drew you to turning toward adventure races after starting with trail running?
To be honest with you, I had a relationship with Mark and Margot Harris from Adventure Enablers, completely not knowing what adventure racing is. They were the timing company who was doing my trail races. And randomly at a race, I think I had mentioned that I was into mountain biking, and Margot just mentioned to me, hey, you should try out this adventure racing thing. And I was like, what now? So did my first race and got hooked, and then immediately realized that in my region, there's a lot of 15, 24-hour races, but there weren't really a lot of beginner races. So there are a lot of parks and areas near in this DC region where there would be a great spot to put on like these smaller events. So when we first started, we wanted to do just that. So our first adventure race was just a 5-hour race. The next one was just a 3-hour race. And like we were really trying to hone in on just getting people introduced to the sport, figuring that they could eventually, if they wanted to, graduate up the ladder and go do these other bigger races. But, there are a lot of people who are willing to jump straight into an expedition, but there's a lot of people who aren't. It seems maybe scary to them, or they just want to dip their toe into it. And we wanted to give them that opportunity. And that's a place we started, and that's a place we're planning on staying. So we do some longer races. We do a 4 and a 10, or a 4 and a, this upcoming fall is going to be a 4 and a 14. Our commitment is to always do that beginner race, and then the longer race is kind of the add-on.
Yeah, so this
fall's event, Fall Foliage, as we said, is going to be a regional qualifier. So it's 14 hours long, correct? Okay, so this fall's event, the Fall Foliage, is 14 hours, correct?
That's correct. 14 hours. And honestly, we kind of started doing this at the request of our racers. We started with 3 and 5, and people asked us if we could do something a little longer because they wanted to graduate up the ladder. So we started doing 10, 12, 9, stuff like that. And then after a couple of those, we had some racers tell us that they wanted to try nighttime, but they weren't ready for the full 24-hour commitment of going all the way through to the morning. So we got the idea of racing until midnight. And we did that for the first time last year, and everybody loved it. It rained 14 of the 15 hours last year, but everybody had a smile on their face and asked us to do it again. So that's what we're doing, is we're basically going into the night. So you get a good 4 or 5 hours in the dark, but you don't have to go all the way through to morning.
That's great. That's a great idea. And yeah, a really fun way to get that taste of nighttime racing in. So, a regional qualifier, in a lot of ways, a regional qualifier is largely like any other longer event. But is there anything different that you are doing with kind of your course design, your event management, because this is a regional qualifier?
There is. And I would say specifically for the 14-hour course. For the 4-hour course, I've been very open about it. I've told we got known for doing a lot of no biking races. This is actually the first time we're not offering a no biking division. And for the 4-hour race, I was very specific with everybody that it's going to be some of the easiest biking they're going to do in the 4-hour race. For the 14-hour race, that's not the case. There's going to be single track, there's going to be gravel, there's going to be elevation, all kinds of stuff for them to deal with. And then my background is kind of a bit more in orienteering. And I would say this race, because it's a regional qualifier, I'll be honest, is going to be a lot more navigation heavy. It's going to start a little bit linear. I'm revealing a little bit about the course. It's going to start a little bit linear, but then it's going to be a lot of Rogaine style. So there's going to be a lot of strategic choices that people are going to have to make. And I feel like that's going to play to the teams who aren't just running and following. It's going to be a lot more who's the best navigator is really going to play out in this race.
Great. So you mentioned Rogaine style, at least for a chunk of the course. And, for our newer listeners, I mean, we've talked about this with past race directors, but again, that typically means you have much more choice in terms of when you get checkpoints and, what order to get them in. What about how you design courses in terms of what's mandatory versus what might be optional, or is everything mandatory in your courses?
Yeah, so we because we kind of started in the beginner nature, we almost went in the opposite direction with our races where everything is optional. What we've done now in kind of our longer races, we've started putting requirements like you have to get at least 1 or 2 in each leg. Like you can't completely skip a leg and still be in the official, top of the rankings. Like we don't want you to go so strategic as you're like, I'm just skipping this because it's going to take a long time to paddle and I'd rather be on the bike. So we do require people to at least participate in all the different legs, but a lot of our leg design tends to be, you need to get at least 1 or 2 or something of that nature, unless, of course, it's linear, in which case that pretty much makes it mandatory because you're going to have to get the checkpoints to progress along the course. So it's going to be a mix of that in the race. Like there's going to be different sections of the area that you're going to be in, and then you can't skip it because you need to get to the next leg.
Yeah. What about anything about this year's course that you're willing to share that you are particularly excited about? It could be a specific stage of the event, a discipline, a checkpoint. Anything that you are able to tease people with a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind teasing a little bit. The race is in, if you're just looking online and you see where the race is, we're starting and finishing at a historical site. It's George Mason's Gunston Hall. It's the actual home of George Mason, one of the founding fathers, and that's where we're starting and finishing the race. But that whole area is on an area called the Mason Neck Peninsula. It basically sits between 2 different bays and in the Potomac River's on the south of it. So it's this peninsula that kind of sticks out in the river, and there's a bunch of nature conservancies. There's different parks, and even Bureau of Land Management has an area in there. The paddling, I'm particularly excited to get people on. I'm willing to let people know that there's actually going to be multiple paddling legs in this race. And the reason for that is because I really want people to see some of the really cool things. I I lost count of how many bald eagles I flew under when I was doing the course design on this one. It's an absolutely gorgeous area to go and do a paddle. Everything else is good. I'm not denying that all the other stuff is good, but the paddling is the part that, like, if you like to just get out in the wilderness, that's the part I think people are really going to enjoy.
That sounds amazing. It makes me think I'm going to take my USARA hat off for a moment. Full disclaimer, I'm putting on my rootstock racing hat. And it's probably just worth sharing that our two races are kind of partnered up this year in a very small, duathlon type series. So people have an opportunity to participate in both of these fall events. So, I would love to come down to your event. I have a feeling I might be in the field working on mine that weekend, unfortunately. But it sounds spectacular. And so you've mentioned the Potomac. How far away are we from Washington, D.C.?
From a drive, maybe 5-10 minutes. This is pretty close to DC proper. It's also pretty close to where we did our spring race earlier this year. But yeah, it's just right outside the area, right off the Potomac River.
Wow, that's a really amazing area to have a race in. That's pretty cool. Great. Well, one final question. If we were talking to some beginners about thinking about taking on a longer event like your 14-hour, any specific pieces of advice you would offer them?
The big thing I would tell the beginners is come out and be prepared to have a good time. The one thing I always tell people is, like, know your race director. And there's nothing wrong with it, but we all just have different styles. And like I said, I tend to be more navigation and let me find cool things for you to find. I don't really do punishing. I don't do, like, because I got to go set the flag and I got to go pick it up and I don't want to go through a bunch of briar. So don't worry too much about needing to go through all the thornery. But be prepared to come out and have a good time. We have a lot of people. This might be our most attended race that we're going to do in our history, which means there's going to be 250, maybe 300 people out there today. So it's a good race to come out and have a good time and see other racers.
Wonderful. Well, Alan, thank you for your time today. Can you remind us about the actual date? I don't think we said that up front.
Yep. Fall Foliage Adventure Race, October 19th. It's in Lorton, Virginia. It's out of George Mason's Gunston Hall. So come see us.
Great. And just a reminder and, further clarification, USARA does have a couple of events sometimes in the fall that are actually regional qualifiers for the following year's national championship. So, as I said at the beginning, while this event's taking place in 2024, the winner of the event in the premier mixed gender division will receive a spot for nationals in 2025. So we're excited to be working with you, Alan. Good luck with all your final coursework and have a wonderful rest of your summer season.
Yep. Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. Today, with nationals a month and a half away, we're going to take the opportunity to talk to Troy Farrar and Steph Ross about the history of USARA and the national championship. Troy Farrar founded USARA back in 1998. He organized the first national championship in 2000 before passing the torch to the new organizational group in 2020. He currently organizes and runs US Endurance, which focuses on a variety of sports, including gravel riding, mountain biking, and also some off-road duathlon. He sanctions over 400 events and also organizes a national championship for gravel grinding. Steph Ross started racing in 2002 and began race directing shortly thereafter, organizing her first edition of the infamous and famous FIG race in 2003. She directed the national championship for USARA in 2011 and 2015 in Kentucky. And she's been vetting, or at least helping to vet, most, if not all, of the nationals courses going back to 2010. Steph has also been part of the USARA board for over a decade and currently is helping USARA organize and run our annual national championship. So Troy, Steph, I'm excited to have you both here and would love to hear a little bit more about your kind of histories and passions for the sport to introduce you to our listeners.
This is Troy. Excited to be here as well. I guess I was lucky enough to kind of get involved in adventure racing right when it was starting off in the United States. And it's been, really fun to watch it grow and to just meet so many people and to see guys have so much fun racing, especially at nationals, to meet teams from all over the country and to get to travel around the country and see how different race directors their take on the courses. So was very blessed to be involved with that, like from the early days on, and just to see it grow.
Yeah, this is Stephanie. Thanks a lot for having us on, Brent. I also feel super lucky to be involved in this organization and with this race on the backside. As much as I love racing, people often ask you, well, wouldn't you prefer to race nationals? And I think, for me, that's an easy no. I'd much rather be on this side of things. Number one, it doesn't hurt quite so much. I still don't get any more sleep than anyone else does, and maybe less some years. But it's just a really great way to stay connected to the community and to be able to, it's kind of like our little annual reunion. And it's really nice to be able to see all the teams as they come through TAs and the finish line and all of that. And you just get a really different perspective on it and an opportunity to connect to racers and the staff and volunteers that you don't get when you're racing. So I feel super lucky to be involved and appreciate that USARA lets me keep doing this year after year.
Yeah, that's actually a great place to start. As a race director myself and as a racer and a relatively competitive racer, I have for the last several of years really started reflecting on my career and where I get the most satisfaction, and increasingly feel like it is from the race directing. It's just such a different experience kind of being behind the scenes. And, as I kind of said to, I think, our race field after the last Endless Mountains multi-day race, the thing I started to really think about was when I'm racing, I get this amazing, incredibly intense experience with 2 or 3 other people. And we get to journey the course, and it's phenomenal. When I'm race directing, I get to share that experience with 30, 40, 50, 60 teams, right? Because I know what's going on in the course. I'm watching their dots. I'm seeing them in transition. I'm talking to them when they're out on the race course. I'm hearing from the volunteers about what they're seeing. And it makes the experience that much richer for me. So I imagine that has been the case for both of you with your long enduring histories with nationals, that you've gotten that kind of satisfaction out of being involved in such a community focused race.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I was just thinking the other day, like most of my close friends are all people that came from adventure racing back when I was producing races, back when I was racing. But like you said, I think you really, when you're racing, you're only racing with a couple of people. And so it's more when I was putting on races, and then a lot of times we'd all camp out after the race. We had a big group, and that's really where most of my closest friends came from, and friends like Stephanie that came from national championships.
So Troy, let's go back in time a little bit. And so 1998, right? You founded USARA. I'd love to hear a little bit about what happened in 1998 or leading up to it that led you down this path into the world of adventure racing, and to take this like giant step into creating a national organization at a time when there was nothing like that, right? Let's start there. We'll save nationals for a minute, but just tell us a little bit about the founding of USARA as an organization.
Yeah, so I was a college coach, and I really wanted to open a promotions company and put on events. And I love anything that gets people outside and gets some dirty. I'm in for it, And so, and originally I was thinking more traditional, like I'm going to put on softball tournaments and volleyball tournaments or whatever, And it's really right when the Eco Challenge hit. And I was a dirt bag. I was a mountain biker and a climber. And so we started watching the Eco Challenge, and we're like, man, we got to do that. And then the entry fee was like $14,000, I think. And I was broke. We're like, we can't afford to do that. And so I was like, well, let's do one that's for broke guys like us here in the US. And we started looking around, and there really weren't any, or there's very few. So then I was like, you know what? I'm going to put one of these on that dirt bags like us can do, so I put on started putting things together, I ended up being the first race in Texas, and I paid an insane amount for my insurance for my first race. I paid like $5,000 or $6,000 for insurance.
Wow.
And so I started calling a couple of the other guys, Dan Barger out on the West Coast and Don Mann. And I was like, hey, what are you guys doing for insurance? And they're like, oh, we're getting mauled. And, and I'm like, and we started doing it. I started racing and being a climber, especially, I was seeing some sketchy things happen at races that I was like, man, this is not how a rope section should be set up and run, and I was also looking around seeing racers who knew nothing about it. So they were just trusting that everything was set up right. And where I was checking to make sure everything's double anchored and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what, we've got to get some safety standards in place or someone's going to get seriously hurt. So really it kind of started USARA with me calling the other race directors that were putting on events and saying, look, if we all get together, maybe we can get some insurance a little cheaper as a pool. We'll have some buying power, and hey, we need to get some safety standards. Some of you guys have a climbing background or a water background, so your water sections are safe. And, we just want to make sure that we're all doing things right and keeping our racers safe and everyone's having fun. And that's really how it started. And that's kind of why our initial board were really some of those pioneers of the sport. It was Dan Barger, Don Mann, Tracy Thayer. I don't know if you remember her. And so, and those were early American guys that were on early American teams that raced in races like the Eco Challenge or the Mild 7 or Southern Traverse. Like those, a lot of our early race directors were guys that had done some of the big races. And so, which also brought some baggage with it. Like, they all actually, I can remember early on that a lot of those early guys saying, a 24-hour race is not an adventure race. That's ridiculous. If it's not at least 3 days long, it's not an adventure race. So there was, different battles that we fought early on to be like, hey, man, everyone is not as hardcore as you guys are. If we want the sport to grow, we can't start with a 3-day race. Can't be the big entry level, to adventure racing. And so we had some heated battles and things over that, but it worked out well. We had some guys that had a lot of passion for the sport early on, and really, they're the ones that helped build the foundation for adventure racing in the United States. And so I'm always indebted and love those guys for all of that.
I saw that very early in my career. I started adventure racing in 2005 and started here in Pennsylvania with the Goals Adventure Racing Association, founded by Ann and Bill Gibbons. And Bill, I know, was at least part of your early team as well. And, from the beginning, both as a racer and a student of the sport, but also eventually as a member of their race team and a race director for them. I can't stress how important safety management was to Bill, especially. And I think that, that has been a through line for USARA for a long time, like the emphasis of really trying to work with sanctioned race directors on safety management. I do want to just pause and have every racer listening to this just stop and appreciate one thing you said right away, that 25 years ago, Eco Challenge Adventure Race, despite having millions of dollars of backing from major TV industries, was charging people $14,000 for a race. It's still one of the best bargains out there is adventure racing, in terms of that economic input. So it just makes me laugh a little bit about, it's an expensive sport. It remains an expensive sport, but it's actually become a sport that's cheaper than it used to be. So interesting there. Steph, I know you weren't involved with USARA back in the late 90s or early 2000s, but how did you get into the sport of adventure racing?
So I started adventure racing after I did my first marathon in 2002, and I ended up with IT band syndrome over the course of that marathon, and so I wasn't able to run. And I had bought myself a bike for my birthday that year. And I liked biking okay, but it wasn't running. And I needed something to motivate me to get out and ride my bike more because I was afraid I was going to lose my fitness. So I think I just looked up on the internet something about biking and, racing or something like that. And I ended up stumbling across the Jeep Kentucky Adventure Race put on by Odyssey Adventure Racing at Carter Caves. It was the first adventure race in Kentucky. It was a 12-hour race, and I entered it solo because I had just qualified for Boston, right? I could do a 12-hour adventure race. I don't know what it is, but it can't be that hard. obviously it completely kicked my butt, and I was completely hooked.
And so you started, and unlike a lot of people in the sport who often race for years and years before race directing, before you knew it, you were directing races. How did you get to that point? And did you kind of start working with USARA right away when you started directing races? As a sanctioned race director, that is?
Yeah, well, it was, again, just an overabundance of confidence that said, well, I've done an adventure race. Surely I can direct an adventure race. And I was at the time doing some guide work with an outfitters down in the Red River Gorge. And I was super excited about adventure racing and told him about it and said, why don't we put on an adventure race in the Red River Gorge? And so we did. And I don't remember when we first got involved with USARA. My guess is that probably when the fellow I was working with at True North Outfitters eventually turned that race over to me. And my guess is that I probably was looking for insurance for it, but it might have been earlier than that we wanted to be USARA sanctioned, just to be maybe a USARA sanctioned race to be affiliated with that organization. Honestly, I don't remember.
Yeah. So, Troy, you founded this organization. As you said, you talked about, this was, partly a practical organization. You came together to help race directors with insurance, also to try to create a safer landscape for race directors to organize events and for racers to compete in. And after 2-3 years, you decided to create a national championship. So walk us through that history. How did you go from just kind of starting this broader organization to actually organizing your first national championship?
So if I remember correctly, it was actually Dan Barger who threw the idea out there first. And I don't know if you know his history, but he was a really good adventure racer. But Dan's real background is an ultra runner. He's was a fantastic ultra runner. And he then, even kind of after his adventure racing, being a race director and career, he kind of went back and started ultra running again. He's really, really good ultra runner. So I think Dan was kind of the first one that threw it out and to the board, like, hey, we should think about this. And we are all like, that's a great idea. And that's when, and Dan hosted our very first one. We hosted the first one in California with him. And when we started, we actually would rotate it from Western United States, Central United States, Eastern United States, and Western, Central. So that happened for, I think it was like the first 12 years we did that. But then things ebb and flow. Some year, at one point, the West Coast adventure racing died down a lot there, and it was a lot bigger on the East Coast. So that's when we kind of just started picking race directors to host it, because we were like, well, it doesn't make sense to make 90% of the racers travel all the way across the United States to go to the race. And so that's when we kind of threw the moving it every time out the window, and just kind of went to trying to play really great places to race and really great race directors.
Yeah, and that's still, an ongoing discussion within the adventure racing community. We did direct nationals in California back in 2022, and it was a great course and a bit of a smaller field. But we'd still love to figure out a way to keep growing things. And hopefully, I think we will bring nationals back out west, despite the potential of it being a smaller field. But you're right. I think adventure racing, whether we're talking about a short race or a national championship or a multi-day race, having a big field often relies on having a community that is close enough to the event to easily get to it. So it's definitely still a challenge. All right. So on that note, thinking about similarities and differences, right? We've already kind of identified some similarities here, but I'm kind of curious, we can open this up to both of you. How do you feel like the sport, specifically through the lens of nationals, has evolved? What are some things that seem relatively the same, to those first nationals back in 2000, 2001, and what's changed regarding the national championship over the last almost 25 years of hosting it?
I would say, so one of the things I think is the same, and is that you have different teams that have different, you have teams that come that have different expectations or different goals. And so there's a group that want to win it or think they can win it. And some of them can and some of them can't, but they still think they can, right? Which is great. And then there's a group that are shooting for, can we crack the top 10? And maybe a group that's like, hey, can we crack the top 20? And a group that's like, we want to do better than we did last year. And then there's a group that's like, well, we just want to finish the thing. If we can get through the race and finish it. And we love all of that. Like, it's great. Like, there, it's different goals. What's really cool is to see a team that's, can we just finish it? And then 5 years later, they're like, hey, we're in the top 10 now or something like that. I love that, but I love it all. Like, I love to see, and I think that's part of the spirit of adventure racing. Like, you just see guys that are out there, guys and girls that are having fun and getting dirty and running around in the woods. And so I think that's kind of always been there. From what I saw, I mean, definitely teams got faster as time. It's kind of like every sport. As things go on, everyone's faster, and so it definitely got a lot faster. Teams got more well-rounded, where they're strong in all the disciplines, I think. And so I think for me, that's kind of what my take on it. What about you, Steph? What do you think?
Yeah, I first became involved in 2010, so I can't speak to those early years, but it seems to me that since then, the courses have had to become longer and harder because the top teams have been getting faster and better. At the same time, I think that the diversity of the field in terms of ability has probably grown as well. So the teams at the back of the pack are probably not covering as much distance percentage wise. And so it's become a lot more challenging for race directors, for the course designers, to try to design a course that's going to keep this field together, that's going to be a challenge to the top teams and still doable for the back of the pack team. So it's become more challenging, I think, from a course design perspective. But it's been great, like Troy said, to see more people being able to access nationals and compete at that level, and, to compete alongside the top teams in the country and give them something to aspire to and measure themselves by. That's been pretty cool to watch.
Yeah, I just remember my first experience with nationals was 2007 in, I think it was Potosi I don't know how you pronounce it, Potosi, Missouri. And, I was pretty green. I think I'd raced for 2 years at that point, and was pretty wide-eyed to arrive at the race and just be there. And it was such a cool experience, right? To be part of it and see all these great teams, a couple of whom I knew from my region, but, all these other teams who I'd, read about in other races. And it was unlike any other event I had been to at that point, at least. So a pretty special experience. And then, like you said, it's like the ultimate event for kind of goal setting, right? Because you can go year after year and, measure your progress and kind of gauge how you're doing.
Well, one other thing I thought about that's different, we started with co-ed, and actually the first 2 years we had an open division, but it was all male back then. There was no races offering all female teams, and there were, as far as I know, no all female teams back in 2000 in those days. But we actually dropped the all male or the open division after a couple of years. So for a number of years, it was just co-ed, and then I guess in 2004 we added co-ed masters. But so now to see all the male teams, all the all female teams, like that's something that's different also, which is awesome to see. We have a lot of different categories now, along with co-ed and co-ed masters, and to see how they're growing. I mean, this year you guys have a phenomenal amount of all female teams that are racing, and Stephanie was a big part of that. She really was one of the big drivers of helping create more female teams, get those girls trained up and ready to get confident and ready to get out there. And so that's something, I think that's a part of the sport that she kind of will always have her name stamped on as someone that really helped grow that part of adventure racing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steph, I would love for you to take a moment here to give the listeners a summary, though I also want to remind everyone we actually did a special flash podcast with you several months ago about the history of the Women in AR initiative. So for added detail, go look for that episode in the archives. But Steph, can you, share a little bit about your effort to kind of increase the attendance of all women's teams at nationals, and where that started, how it started, and what you've seen happen since you started it leading up till this year?
Yeah, so we opened up nationals to basically open teams, whether all male or all female, in 2012. And we had a number of all male teams that year. And for the next several years, the all male team category grew. And I got a little frustrated coming to nationals and not seeing any all female teams. And I said to Troy, what if we break that open and have an all male division and a women's division separately? And at the time we were kind of thinking about in terms of prizes, because we had, pretty good prize table going on. And Troy said, if you can get 5 all women teams, I'll make it its own separate category with all the same prizes. And I said, all right, well, there's my goal. And, so to try to recruit women teams to come, I basically set up a scholarship that was similar to the scholarship that race directors would give to the winning mixed gender team for the regional qualifiers. They got a scholarship, and I thought, well, we'll just give a scholarship to the women teams coming. So that's kind of was how we started that in 2017, and we had 4 all women teams come in 2017. So even though we missed our goal of 5 by a little bit, Troy was kind enough to give us our title and prizes, and he loaded them up. And so then it kind of took off from there. And, we had sort of steady growth, and then it kind of plateaued until this year. And after we started the Women of AR race team last year, where we're giving the winning team the title of Women of AR race team, and they get a stipend and a lot of free entries to different races around the country, thanks to all these USARA race directors who have donated race credits and that sort of thing. That blew up the category this year. And right now we've got 15 teams registered in the all women category. So we're super excited about that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
One asterisk I want to throw out there. I wasn't trying to stifle the women by saying we've got to have 5 teams, just to make sure everyone understands that. What was important at the time, I felt, was if we were going to have a women's division and we're going to award a national championship, them as national champions, that there was actually a field they raced against, because I didn't want to take away from all the other guys that were national champions that were racing against a big field by having one team show up, complete the course, and be like, hey, we're national champions. I was like, that didn't feel right. And so I was always so excited that Steph, 4 teams was good enough, that we got it going, and then that she worked so hard. And now you look at the fruit of that labor. Like, it's awesome to hear about how that division is continuing to grow.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, before I started working with USARA in a more full-time kind of capacity back in 2020, I worked with you quite a bit as an advisory board member for, I don't remember, 7-8 years maybe before that. And I know that, one of the things we always talked about as an organization, beyond just the all women's division, is really wanting nationals to be a big event. Right. Like an event with a lot of people. Like it's okay when it isn't. If it, just happens in a given year, we only end up with 20 or 30 teams, which hasn't happened a lot, but it's happened once or twice. It's okay. It can still be a great race. But it's a different experience when you have 60, 70, 80 teams on the start line. It really gives it a different level of cachet. So,
and it's a different experience for the teams. It's a lot more fun, I think, I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, Steph, I don't, you had actually showed me some numbers recently. I don't know if you had them open, but just thinking, so 15 teams of all women squads, that's 45 racers, right? 45 individual racers coming in nationals that identify as women. I don't know how many mixed gender teams we have. And then on those teams, whether it's one woman or 2 women on the teams, but like your work over nearly the last decade has really clearly helped bring women into the sport. I'm wondering if you have those individual numbers in front of you of kind of the historic breakdown, just like for comparison's sake, in terms of the percentage of the field that's all women or not. Steph's looking for that. While she's looking for it, Troy, I'm going to bounce back to you for a minute. So we talked briefly about how the first couple of years of nationals, there was an open division that was all male teams. And then you moved away from that. And you alluded to that very traditionalist viewpoint on nationals being really, it should just be mixed gender teams, right? Because that's what air quote adventure racing is.
Early on, a lot of our board members, I mean, you were joking, or we were talking about, they were very traditional adventure racers, and really their experience, most of those guys were really good expedition racers. That's kind of how, really it started with expedition racing. So a lot of those guys had raced in the Eco Challenge or the Southern Traverse or Mile 7, these big early expedition races. So, number one, they thought we should only be co-ed because that's what those races do. And also they thought it should be really, really long, longer the better. They at first, they wanted national championships to be multiple days long. And I was like, nobody's going to come. Like everyone's doing 8-hour races and they can't come and do a 5-day race or whatever. And so, I can't remember, but I'm looking back, I'm surprised we even did have an open division to start. But I think what we used us guys that thought it was a good idea to have an open division, the ones on the board, I think, what we used to try to convince them were, look, we got to get enough teams to at least be able to pay our race director. And we won't with just co-ed, but if we add the male division, maybe we'll get enough or whatever. And so, but really, we didn't have that many male teams come early on, and that's why we dropped it after a couple of years, and then later brought it back when we just saw, male was massive when we brought it back. Like every race around the country had just as many male teams as co-ed, or almost as many. So we decided to bring it back. And one other change, I was digging back in the memory. We started off with 4-person teams. Nationals was 4-person in 2000. And we stayed 4-person until 2004. And we had two reasons to switch to 3-person. One was canoes. We're like, hey, instead of having to have 2 canoes for every team. I mean, think about this year. You guys have 80-something teams. And I'm guessing that you even struggle to find that many canoes. What if you had to find 160 canoes, right? So we started seeing that was going to be a problem. But also, it was really interesting. We kind of realized we would lose a lot of teams right before nationals because someone would get sick or something would come up. And I think a lot of teams already were racing as 3-person teams and had found someone else, but then to try to find someone else. And by making it 3, we just lost way less teams. We kind of figured that might happen, I think, because a couple of our board members, it had happened with them. And so 3-person was easier to grab another person if you lost one, or to build at least. Like we'd have teams that couldn't go because one person couldn't get off work. So if you had a team that was racing as 4 and they could only send 3, it made it easy for them or whatever. And instead of trying to find someone else. So that's another reason we went to the 3-person. And that seemed to work a lot better. It seemed, for both reasons.
Yeah. And, again, like similarities, these are the exact same kinds of conversations we're still having, like logistically. And I don't know this scientifically, but as a race director myself, it has become harder over the last 15 years of race directing to source boats. It's not as popular anymore. There's not as many companies renting boats. In our region for a long time, Goals and then us and Goals, we would rent canoes from this one organizer. They had a ton of boats, and then they, a few years ago, they kind of aged out. They sold the company and stopped doing their work. We can't source boats anymore. And if we can, they're not going to be any kind of uniform fleet. Like it's impossible to get your hands on 80 or 160 boats that are all the same. So interesting questions, and yeah, the pressures on teams to field 4 folks. I have one more question there, and then Steph will bounce back to you if you found that some of that data. So you mentioned, right, like you started with an open division, you went away from it, for whatever reason, to kind of balance the community's desire for a more traditional approach to adventure racing. When you came back to it, all of a sudden there was high demand, even though those first couple of years you said there weren't a lot of all-male teams. What happened in that roughly decade where when you brought the open division back, all of a sudden you did have, dozens of all-male teams available and interested in racing nationals?
Well, it was, I think, just because you saw across the country, all the race directors are putting on races, their male divisions grew. It was kind of the same as nationals. Us guys that were putting on races at the time, the majority of the teams that did our races were co-ed teams, and we'd have a few male teams at first, but then we saw that division grow and grow and grow. And it grew, for different reasons. The same reason that the female division's growing. There's some people that only want to race with other guys, or some girls that only want to race with other girls. I knew people whose wives said, I'm okay with you going off racing as long as it's with a bunch of guys. I don't want you going off with the girl on the weekend, every weekend, or whatever the reason was. It grew. And I think it's great. Like, I know that big races are traditionally always co-ed. And I do believe it's a different animal racing with girls having to deal with boys and boys having to deal with girls on a team is different than racing with a bunch of guys or probably a bunch of girls. But I think they all have their place in the sport. And I'm very happy to see that that's healthy. And, it was a good change as we saw that grow in the sport. And it's great to see that it continues that way. Yeah. And masters, we added a masters division too, because, really what happened was as people started getting older, they're like, hey man, we can't run with the 20-year-olds anymore, but we still want to do this, but coming to nationals doesn't feel like we have a chance. And although we've seen times when the masters are just as fast as the open, but generally they're going to be a little older and a little bit slower. So I thought it was great when we started the masters division as well.
Yeah. At the end of nationals last year, Garrison, right, the executive director of USARA, Michael Garrison, had done a rough calculation and I think said the average age of attendance at nationals was something like 44, 45, something like that, right? And, for a long time, I think the nationals qualification was somewhere in the 40 to 45 range. So the question, of course, is like, what exactly is masters in our sport? Because it's a sport that privileges age and wisdom sometimes more so than most.
For sure. So. And we moved it up. Yeah. We actually, whatever age we started, what is masters now? I don't remember. Is it 45 or?
I think it has been 45. I think that, we may have bumped it up to, Steph, do you remember? Did we bump it up to 50?
Well,
like
we do it now based on the combined age. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the team and a minimum.
Yeah. So we started at 40, and then at one period we're like, everyone starts saying that's too young, and so then we moved it incrementally 1 year until we moved it up to 45 actually. Yeah. Because we didn't want to take someone that had raced masters and be like, oh, you can't race it next year because we're just going to jump it all the way to 45 and you're 43 or something like that. So we moved it up with them and to 45. So
yeah. Steph, back to you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so masters is defined as an average age of 55 for the team and a minimum age of 45 for all team members.
Yeah.
Okay, so it can be either one. So one other division we had for a little bit was a collegiate division. And we never, and you'll actually, you'll recognize a couple of names from the team that won our first collegiate division was Tim Buchholz and Anna Numlin from Rib Mountain Racing were on that team, actually. So you guys, most of everyone out there that races a lot will know those guys.
Of course.
And so we had, and that one, that actually came out of, CBS came to us. They had a show for a while called Collegiate Nationals, and they had all of these competitions. They got all the people from different, from boxing, from triathlon, from whatever, from track. And they had this TV show with Collegiate Nationals. So we started there with a sprint race. It was maybe like 3 hours long. It was kind of funny that the first year they brought in Johnny Mosley. Do you guys remember him? He was like an Olympic skier, really cool guy.
Yeah.
And he was the MC of the adventure race. Him and we had Robin Benacasa there. And so Robin took Johnny out on the course and made him run through some, the river or swim through a freezing river. And I I believe we're in Reno, and do some stuff. And it was kind of funny because I was doing something, the race was going on, and I was doing something, and Johnny comes up and he's like, hey, Troy. And I'm like, hold on, Johnny. And like, he's like a little kid. He's like jabbing me in the ribs. And I'm like, hold on, man. I was doing something. Finally, I'm like, what's up? What's the problem? And he's like, I'm freezing. Robin, took me through the river and I'm freezing to death. Is there a place I can warm up or get a towel? I'm like, come on, dude. You're like a winter sport. You're a tough Olympian. Like, what's the deal? And I'm like, welcome to adventure racing, Johnny. And we're laughing, teasing him, but we got him dry. And so it was really crazy. Like that first sprint collegiate one, I mean, they had helicopters with guys and cameras hanging out, like flying along the guys while they're mountain biking, filming it. It was CBS, right? And so they put this thing on, and the teams that came out, they're like, I feel like I'm in the Tour de France or something. This is crazy. And so we also, after that, we did it for 2 years, and then that thing, it just kind of died. The CBS Collegiate Nationals, I guess, died. But we also brought it into the long race. We're like, well, hey, let's see if we can get college kids in. We know it's expensive for them to buy all the gear, but we had tried to get that going. So that was another division that was there for a bit.
So in that first one that was part of the bigger games rather than being part of nationals, how many teams actually were involved in that event? This is now I'm going to tell you when you get TV involved, they want a big show, right? They're like, because that was our problem when they're like, we want to do collegiate national. We want you guys part of this TV show, and we're like, ooh, we want to do this. This is great for the sport. Like this will get us really good publicity, get more people in the sport, highlight some of the people that are there. But I told them, I'm like, I don't know how many college teams we're going to be able to get. There's just not that many. Are you guys okay if we have 5 teams show up? And they're like, oh, we don't love that. And so then we said, what if we have just a regular co-ed division and male division and whatever, and have them all race together? And they're like, we just won't tell everyone that they're not all college guys or whatever. I'm like, that's your show. You guys can do whatever you want to do on your show. Oh my
We're going to award, and so we actually had 50 or 60 teams, but honestly, probably 5 of them were collegiate teams or something.
Wow. Look at that. That's something I haven't heard that story before. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
Steph, did you?
That's great either.
Yeah. Do you have any more numbers for us on kind of the recent surge in all women's teams and kind of how that's changed the complexion of nationals over the years? Or
yeah, I do. So I put together the statistics for a presentation I gave to Orienteering USA talking about marketing navigation sports to women. So I've got the numbers. Before the all-male division or the open division that drew all-male teams in 2012, we always had, at least 33% of the field was women, right? 1 out of 3. At the very least, you occasionally had 2 women on a team. But so we were at 33% participation by women prior to 2012. In 2012, when we started having all male teams, that immediately, of course, dropped the percentage. And in 2012, it was roughly 28% of the field was women. And then over the next several years through 2016, every single year, the percentage of women in the field declined as your all male teams increased, the percentage of women participating decreased, so that by 2016, only 19% of the field was women, basically. And so we, in 2017, by having some all female teams, we got back to that 28% that it had been in 2012. And we've slowly been creeping back up until this year, where we have women. This number is a couple of weeks old, but as of a couple of weeks ago, basically 37% of the field was women. So we're back better than we were before at 33%. And what I'm most excited about with that number is this. So when we first set up the scholarship, I heard some grumblings from some men in the sport who were concerned that we were sort of going to take up all of the women, that there wouldn't be any women for them to field teams in the mixed gender category. And given that that's the elite category of the sport, they felt like that was a fair criticism. Now, I did not hear any of them complaining when we were seeing mixed gender teams numbers go down as the all male team numbers went up. In 2016, we had 26 all male teams and only 32 mixed gender teams. So we were really seeing all male teams basically were about to outnumber mixed gender teams. And I didn't hear anyone complain about that.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is that it's not proven true that having all female teams and the scholarship has depressed those numbers, because we also have a record number of teams overall. So right now we've got a record number of teams overall in the championships. We've got right now 46 mixed gender teams, 15 all female teams, and 22 male teams. So what we've seen is that with the increased participation of these all women teams, we're seeing increased numbers overall in the race. So I'm super excited about that. And, I think it tells us that what we're seeing are a lot of women who would not be doing the race if they had to race on a mixed gender team. There are some all women teams who simply prefer to race with other women and not men. And I think we're instead of taking women from the mixed gender teams necessarily, we're seeing new teams that wouldn't have been racing otherwise.
Yeah. And it goes both ways, right? I mean, I know many all male teams in the sport that have been racing all male for 15 years. And whether it's they're racing with brothers or high school friends or college friends or whatever it might be, like that's obviously a choice and a preference that those teams are making. I do think it's also incredible, though, to think about that perspective of, I think prior to this year, assuming our numbers hold steady and we don't lose any teams, I think the biggest national championship before what we are looking at for West Virginia this year was in Georgia back in 2008. And I think we had something like high 70s or maybe like 80 or 81 teams for that event. And they were all mixed gender teams, right? Back in 2008. So just kind of, interesting. I don't know what that says one way or the other, right? But just kind of some interesting things to muse on in our sport. Steph, as someone that has directed a lot of events, ranging from the FIG to right now you're directing the Unbridled All Women's Adventure Race. You've directed nationals a couple times. When you're not directing nationals, I think you have been at nationals as a kind of go-to head staff member, for lack of an official word or official title. But you've been instrumental in running nationals just about every year for the last decade plus. So you have a lot of race directing experience. I'm curious, what's a little bit unique and different about being on the race directing side of nationals compared to a regular weekend long race?
Yeah, so the primary difference is that you're directing by committee, if you will. So the amount of collaboration that's involved in directing nationals versus just directing your own race where you're calling all of the shots. And there are upsides and downsides to that. I think primarily there are upsides. A lot of it kind of depends on the personalities involved in any given year. We always have a different race organization and a different race director designing the course year after year. So you're kind of getting to know, and it's always someone we've worked with before, but you're getting to know them in a different way, getting to know their race directing style. And so in that respect, it's a little different year to year, but, really the main difference is that collaboration. And, we've changed a lot over the years with that too, in terms of, we always want to try to, have the race director put their own stamp on it. But, the amount of involvement that USARA has in course design has evolved some over the years as we've learned things and evolved. But, for the most part, I think that the collaboration part of it, we end up with a better product, because the USARA is bringing a lot of lessons learned and a lot of institutional knowledge that we've gathered over the years. We're bringing that to the event, and then the race directors bringing their own, unique style and personality. And I think in the end, we end up with a better product.
Yeah. Troy, I see you nodding there. You clearly agree with what Steph's saying. Is there anything else you've kind of reflected on as being a little bit different about nationals?
That one of the things I used to love about nationals, we had built such a great team that would come every year, which was, early on it was Patrick Harper and Stephanie, and if people don't know who Patrick Harper is, he raced for Team Montreal forever for a sponsored team. For a long time, he was considered the best navigator in adventure racing. A phenomenal navigator. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell a really quick Pat Harper story. One time back in those days, this was the early days, we didn't get the maps in his hands until he showed up the week before the race. Like we didn't. Later, we'd get the whole course and we'd help make changes and all that stuff. Back in those days, he'd get there, and so he got there, and we were going to go put out some checkpoints. So I was going to go with him. He just got off, drove in from the airport, and I said, hey, here's the map. I've already marked the points on it for you. So he takes the topo map, and so he's not seen it before. Like he hasn't gotten one before he got there, right? He honestly looks at the map for like 5 minutes, and then we walk to the car, and he throws it in the back seat. And I'm like, hey, aren't we going to some of the checkpoints? And he's like, yeah. I said, well, I'll grab the map so I can help navigate you there. He's like, oh, we don't need it. I'm like, what? And he drives straight to a place where he stops, and we get out, we run to the checkpoint, and it's there. And I'm like, what just happened, Patrick? And he's like, I have a photographic memory. Like I can see the map right now in my head. And I'm like, that's one of the reasons you're such a great navigator, Yeah. And so it was an amazing thing. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. But having, after, like Stephanie said, you learn and hopefully you improve every year. And so, there were a couple of years where checkpoints weren't exactly where they were supposed to be, or they were off enough. They caused problems. Obviously, we don't want that to happen for the racers. So we started flying Patrick Harper in every year, and then Stephanie, and then later Dave Waller, when Pat kind of retired. And all three of those, that team, plus we had a few other people that always came in. Like every year, I just love getting together with them. We would cook a big dinner one night, and it was just fun seeing all them and working together to make nationals really good. And really, when we got into the swing of things, obviously as we got better, the Stephanie, and especially once Dave Waller came on, and Dave is an orienteering guy, but he designs courses. So Dave was, I tell you, one of his things he was magic at was looking at a course and going, we move this checkpoint here and this checkpoint here, we're going to change. So they're going to have so many options now of which way to go. Whereas we leave them where they're at, everyone's going the same direction. And so he was really able to improve a lot of courses he could just see, he was so good at that. And I think, Stephanie mentioned the other day when we were talking, Dave wasn't an adventure racer. So he didn't have a problem telling a race director, this will be a better course if you do this. And he didn't have to worry about, now he's going to get mad at me. And Dave didn't know who he was. And Dave's just an honest guy. He's and he's very modest. He's actually not a prideful guy, but he knows his stuff. And we'd be like, he's right. Let's move it. And so I think it was fun seeing, it made it so much more enjoyable for me, because the last thing you want as the event director is for a point to be in the wrong place, something to skew the results of the race or to make it not good for the people that come to race. Like it's all about them having a great time and a great event. And so I slept much better once we got all those guys on board, and they were making sure the checkpoints were in the right place and everything, went well. It was a godsend for me. I probably would have had a heart attack way before then if we wouldn't have got that crew together. So.
Okay, so beyond just the the differences between directing nationals and regular events, any other quick lessons either of you learned about race directing? I think you've alluded to one or two of them, but just like broader lessons about kind of adventure racing and race directing you've taken away from your years with nationals.
I think something that was always a challenge, obviously, it's way easier to do things in your backyard. So if you put on adventure races all the time, you've got a pool of volunteers, you kind of just have everything dialed. You've got your boat guy, you're used to dealing with everyone. So, that was one thing when you do nationals. Now you're moving it all over the country. You're dealing with a different race director every year, and you're actually relying on them for a lot of things that are super important for the race to be successful. But thankfully, I think, we had a great group of race directors. And so they did a good job. And it was always, one of my favorite things about nationals is just to, everyone generally races in their own region. They race against the same teams every race, and they know you know them all, and you're friends with most of them, and that's fun. But it's really cool to go to a new place you've never raced, and to all these teams you have no idea who they are, how good they are, and you've heard of them. You're like, oh, that's Rootstock Racing. Yeah, those guys are really good out on the East Coast. Can we beat those guys or not? Or, we're really good on the West Coast. Are we as good as them, or are they going to blow us out of the water? What's going to happen here? And so I think it was super fun. Brent, especially you've raced on a team that competes for the national championship for years. Like, I would think that was really fun for the teams as well. We love seeing that. It was fun to get to know teams from all over the country. And I think it was fun. I think about a team like, let's say Team Technu from the West Coast. I think you're probably good friends with those guys and other teams that you're against that you never would have met them probably if it wasn't for nationals, and so I always loved that part of it. And so I thought that was always a really neat part about nationals, and one of my favorite parts, actually.
Yeah. Steph, anything from you in terms of any other just broader lessons learned about adventure racing or event management?
Well, I guess maybe the number one lesson is you can never start planning too early.
Yeah.
It always comes on quicker than you expect, especially if you want to try to get sponsors, right? You can't wait until the year of nationals to try to get sponsors. They've all done their budget the year before. They're business people.
Yep.
So you can't start planning too early, and everything is going to take longer than you expect.
Yep. Yes, good words of advice there. So, all right, so we're heading toward the end here. I want to just kind of have a little bit of fun with the next couple questions. We can kind of roll them together, I suppose. They might go together, but favorite moments. And a quick disclaimer, right? I've had the pleasure of competing in every national championship since 2007, with the exception of two. When you guys were down in Georgia, hosted by Adventure Enablers in 2016, and again in 2022 when I couldn't get the time off to go to California. But, I've gotten to do a lot of great events, and they've all been great, and I think we all know, and if anyone ever doubts it, even when events aren't perfect, race directors are really pouring their time and energy and souls and money and, often, calling in favors with family to take time away to go out in the woods by themselves to scout courses for nationals, and all the races we're doing. They've all been great. So just with that disclaimer out there, I'm going to now ask you, what were some of your favorite national championships over the last 25 years? And maybe just kind of in conjunction with that, because I suppose this will help answer that question. What are some of your favorite stories from nationals?
So I'm going to say national championship memories instead of national championships. How about that?
Okay. All right. That's fair.
Championship memories.
That's fair.
Because I would agree with you. We picked race directors because they were great, and we saw some really creative courses and just some neat ideas and different things that happened. So, we could name them all really because of that. They were all favorites. But I'm going to start with the first one because something crazy happened. I'm going to tell two quick stories that I would say highlight what I call the spirit of adventure racing, right? And the first one, it happened right away. Dan Barger's hosting it. He's one of the most experienced race directors out there. And we start off down in this valley with a paddle. They run to the lake and they paddle, and it was hot. It was like mid 70s to low 80s. I remember sitting there on the shore, like sweating and just shorts, I'm stripped down to shorts and a t-shirt. And then after that paddle, they're out there for a few hours. They come off and they've got this monster climb up single track and rough. Some of it was hike a bike, like a 5,000 foot climb that they're going to end up on the top of this mountain. And I remember me and Dan Barger sitting on the tailgate of his pickup, waiting for the first team to come out the top, and it starts snowing, right? And it's getting to be like 5 PM or whatever. The sun's starting to go down, and it is really, really getting really, really cold. And so that night it got way colder than I think people had thought it was going to get. And you've probably heard this story before. I like to tell this story, but there was a team from Florida wasn't used to racing in the mountains and where it was really cold. And so they didn't have the right gear. They weren't prepared for it. And that night there was a long section between another checkpoint. They're all going to be in this mountain for a long time. No one could get to them. I mean, there's phones. I mean, that was probably before we even had cell phones, I think. And so, there's a team from Florida that started getting into trouble. They were getting hypothermic. They're really cold. And a couple of other teams came upon them. They stopped racing. They gathered up firewood. They built a fire. They gathered extra wood for those guys to put on the fire. They even gave them some of their clothes. And then they started racing again. And I just love that story because I was like, man, here's guys that are at the national championship. And they weren't. This wasn't the back of the pack either, right? And I was like, it was so cool. Like they just stopped racing, took care of this team, and then they started racing again. And it was before we had the Spirit Award, but I'm like, that's the spirit of adventure racing right there. Like that was always the first race. I always loved that. And then a second one, kind of a little bit along that line, was in 2013. It was in Brown County, Brown County, Indiana. And early in the race, Wadali, we're an hour into the race, and we're at this part where you guys are on mountain bikes, and they come out, and one of them's seat had broken. I don't remember if it was I don't remember which one, but his seat had broken. He comes up and he's just got a seat post sticking up, right? He's having to ride standing up for an hour because he couldn't sit down. And so there was some guy there that was just fixing to go mountain biking, some local guy. He's getting his bike out. And Justin's like, wow, my seat broke, man. I got to have a seat. So he goes up to this guy and he's like, man, is there any way I can borrow your seat? We're the national championship, And the guy lets him. And we're all watching this take place. So he takes the seat off the guy's bike. He puts it on his and he takes off. And I'm all excited. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I'm getting all excited. And then I go, uh-oh, we have a rule that says you can't take stuff from other people. Like you can only take, if there's a bike shop right there that all teams had access to, you could take it. But at the time, the way the rule is written, you couldn't take something from just a random person like that. And I'm like, are we going to have to disqualify them? And I was like, my heart was broke over that. I was just like, no, that was a cool thing to see. And Stephanie was part of the board then. And so we decided at that point not to say anything to Wadali till after the race because we didn't want it. We wanted them just to have a race. I'm like, hey, I know they might just quit if we told them this, but I don't think they would. That's not who Wadali is. They're going to race anyway. Let's not say anything because we didn't want to upset them during the race or whatever. Let them race. We'll deal with it when the race is over. So the race is over. We tell them what had happened. And by that time as a board, we decided to go to the other teams and let them decide. Because I think Wadali was like second or third. They were going to be on the podium if they didn't get disqualified. So if I remember right, Steph, I think we went to maybe it was the top 10 teams because we're like, well, it still affects everyone, down the row or whatever. Is that right? Do you remember that? You don't know? So anyway, the coolest thing in the world was we told all the teams, go talk about it, take your time. And every single one of them was, we don't need to talk about it. Do not disqualify them. That's awesome. Leave them where they're at. And I love that. I was, especially the team that was, I think it would have been in third or whatever and gets not bumped to fourth. And nobody hesitated. They were like, no way would we disqualify them for that. And so those two memories stand out as like I say, the spirit of adventure racing. I love to see that. Some really unique things that I can remember. We'll start with that very first race again in Kernville, California. At the very end of the race, Dan had this Tyrolean traverse set up that was, it might have been 1,000 feet off. It was crazy how high it was. And it was super cool. Like when people got to it, they were just like, whoa, man. And so it was really, that was super, I think a super cool experience for the teams that were there. And it was really memorable for the guys that did that. And kind of a couple of other along that sort of line was 2002. Just a couple years later, Don Mann was hosting the race in Sapphire Valley, North Carolina, and he had this monster rappel so big that we actually had to go to the climbing rope companies and have special ropes made because it was longer than ropes you could buy. Wow. And then we also had to we bought for all the teams a rappelling device because if you used a figure eight or an ATC, it was such a long rappel, it would get really hot and actually start melting the rope. And so we had to get special rappelling devices, and then teach all the teams how to use them because no one had ever used one before prior to the race. So we could do this really awesome rappel that he had in the event. And I just love it when our race directors find super cool things that they can give that experience to the racers by doing it. So a couple more were in Georgia, the race you missed in 2008. We started that race by climbing on a train and going out in the middle of the woods, and the train stopped and the racers got off, and that's where we started the race. And that was a really unique way, I think, to start the race, and it was fun, and the racers enjoyed it. And then again, in 2014 in Deep Creek, Maryland, I think you probably raced in this one, Brent. We had the boogie board section it's the world's only mountaintop recirculating whitewater rafting course or kayak course, and we boogie boarded a couple of laps in that thing. I thought it was super cool. I don't know if the racers loved it or not. It was cold and rough, something different we hadn't done before, and I loved it. I was like, "This is awesome, man!"
I just got to watch it.
What's that?
I just watched it because you allowed us to do whatever we wanted, including you could have one team member do all 3 loops in, yes, that freezing cold water. We elected to have one teammate do all 3 loops in that freezing cold water. So it was awesome to watch it.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. And then one kind of weird moment or whatever that I remember, it was actually the national championship was in Texas. Some Terra Firma, the guys I'd sold Terra Firma to hosted it. And it rained for days and days before the race. It was raining during the race. We had a couple of checkpoints at the very end of the race that the first team goes out there and they can't find it, and they just come back in. They're like, "It's waist deep water. It's underwater. We can't." And so we had to just take those checkpoints out of the race because the tree or whatever they were tied to, it was underwater in this murky. I mean, you would never find that checkpoint. And so that was one of the how adventure racing goes. Sometimes you got to adapt. Like sometimes things get wacky.
Yeah.
What about you, Seth? Those are things I kind of remember.
So a couple of stories. One of my favorite nationals was the race in the Catskills in Kerhonkson, New York. And that's actually also one of my most vivid memories from nationals was when overnight teams came into the little cafe on top of the mountain. It was freezing cold. They were on their bikes. It was starting to snow, I think. And
oldest day of the year in New York that year.
Yeah. And so it's like 2 a.m. or something. And this cafe ended up staying open. Of course, they were supposed to close at like 9 o'clock or something. But racers were coming in. They were spending money. They were warming up. There was a fire going. They had a grill going. And the woman running it just kept it open until like 3 a.m. or something. And so it became this oasis for racers. And when we talk about the spread, the diversity and abilities between the top teams and the back of the pack teams, what was so funny is you had some teams who were, middle of the pack, back of the pack racers. They came in and they are spread out. They're getting a seat at the table. They're putting in their order for cheeseburgers. They're doing, they're just like relaxing. They're spending an hour in this place, just getting warmed up, getting refueled. And I'm going around with my phone and interviewing teams and that sort of thing. And I see Alpine Shop come running in, and they're they're in a top 5 team, top 10 team. And it was Jeff and Carrie Sona and David Fry. And so I really especially cherish it, of course, because David's not with us anymore, but this is such a vivid memory I have of them. And they came in and, they're running in and running out, and they've got like a $20 bill and they're throwing it across the counter. Just, what do you have that we can put in our mouths right now? And, they had some pizza that you could buy to go. And so they were literally, it was like a minute and a half maybe that they spent in there and just walked out with pizza hanging out of their mouth and took back off. So that was a fun memory that I've got in the Catskills. Can
I butt in for a second? That lady doesn't realize it, but honestly, she probably kept half the teams in that race. If she wouldn't have stayed open and let them warm up, they would have dropped out. So she probably caused a lot more teams to finish than would have if she wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And And I won't say that this was one of my favorite races, since Brent said that I couldn't say Kentucky. But one of my favorite memories was in 2011 when the race was at Cumberland Falls. And another reason it's a favorite sort of crystal memory in my mind is because Scott Cleveland was there. And of course, he's no longer with us either. And before that race that year, I directed it. I started getting these emails from this guy. I'd never heard of him. And he's asking me all these questions about the maps in that area. And are there any other maps he can get? And he's, just asking me all these questions, none of them really inappropriate, but I didn't know who he was. And he was kind of obviously trying to probe and get as much information as he could about the course. So I write to Troy and I'm like, hey, I've got this racer who's sending me emails wanting to get information, Scott Cleveland, do you know this guy? And Troy's like, oh yeah, he's just this amazing navigator and he's just doing his homework. He's trying to be super thorough. There's nothing untoward here. Obviously, we're not going to give him information we wouldn't give anybody else, but he just sort of put my mind at ease. But because Scott was just so diligent in trying to prepare as much as he could possibly prepare, within the parameters of what was allowed, I ended up getting to know him just through these emails before the race. And so when he came and raced Team SOG with Kristen Eddy and Brian Mayer, he had finished second, I think, a couple of times before. He had never won nationals, but he had competed many times and always, second or third. So podium, but never won. When they came in and they were the first team across the finish line and won that year, it just was such a joy for me to see that, because it was a culmination of his obviously having prepared as much as he could possibly prepare. And, then, of course, later when we lost him, that really became a memory sealed in my mind. I was so pleased for him that they won. So that will always be a favorite memory for me as well. And then one last one. So this was one of Brian's races. This may have been Brown County. It was an Indiana race. And we got word partway through the race, the paddle was on this big lake. And one of the points was up in a little cove off of the lake. And so racers were having to paddle through this culvert, great big culvert. They paddled through the culvert and up this cove to get the point. Well, there was this long line, like a buoy type line, across part of that cove that they used to keep debris out of the culvert. And so the problem was, if debris got in the culvert, it clogged it up, it backed up the cove, and it flooded this guy's property who lived by the cove. And so having this buoy line there, I don't know what you call them, but it was really important for him. Well, it just so happened you could have paddled around it, but the straight line was over it. And so teams, of course, start paddling straight over it. They're not seeing any harm to that, and probably there wasn't any harm to it, but this fellow thought there was, because he sees these racers paddling over the buoy line, and he calls whoever the local authority is over the lake and says, I don't know what's going on out here, but these people are paddling across the line. They're going to break it. It's going to flood my property. So there's this big hullabaloo. The permitting authority calls Brian Holtzhausen and says, hey, you got to tell these racers to stop going across that line. Well, there was really no way to tell racers not to do that other than put Stephanie on the road on top of that culvert for the next 10 hours and have her tell every team that goes through there. So we promised the permitting authority that we would have someone sit there at that culvert and tell every single team that went through not to paddle over the line. You got to paddle around the line. And that's what I did in the baking hot sun. Like there was nothing there except for the road and that guy's property. And so I just sat there on the road in the baking hot sun until the sun finally went down. And then I sat there after dark and I stopped every team as they went through. But thinking about that and thinking about Brian Holtzhausen, I'll finish with this, actually reminds me that one of the lessons I've learned, you asked about lessons learned, and we were talking about working with different race directors over the years, and Troy's talked about the tribe and how we all got along so well and we're such a great team. Actually, one of the things that I learned over the course of that, working with especially Brian and Troy, we are not politically aligned at all. We're not spiritually aligned at all. We're as, pretty polar opposite in those respects. And yet we always enjoyed each other's company and, got along. And I love Troy. I love Brian. And we always had conversations along those topics that were respectful and, kind and civilized and, especially in this current climate, the political climate we're in right now, it strikes me that that's actually one of the things that I learned from them was how to have those conversations and the fact that you can't have conversations and respectfully disagree with people. And that doesn't have to define your relationship. And, that's something that was really important to me over the years. And I think I learned from you, Troy, and some of the other people we worked with. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I love that too. Stephanie reminded me of one more thing I'm going to throw in there when you talked about Scott Cleveland. So for those of you that are the people that don't know who he was, like she said, phenomenal navigator and just super nice, really nice guy and a humble guy. And I don't know what nationals it was, but one year I'm at the finish line and they finished and, you're high-fiving the team and saying, great job. And Scott says, hey, by the way, checkpoint 16 was like 4 meters off or 3 meters. He says, something like that. And there's some volunteer standing next to me. I can't remember who it was, but when Scott walks off, he's kind of like rolling his eyes like, what? Who's that guy? And I'm like, that guy's correct as who he is. If he says that checkpoint was off by 3 meters, it's off by 3 meters. I'm like, he's a phenomenal navigator. He definitely would not say that and he wasn't trying to be mean or anything. It was just, if Scott's personality, it was just like a matter of fact, oh, by the way, this. And so I always remember that story and it makes me smile when I think of him and that. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for bringing that back up, Stephanie.
Well, it's great stuff. It's, again, I kind of full circle here, where we started. It's interesting listening to your stories. And, I have only ever attended a nationals as a racer. And so my stories are different, right? They're about the courses or about a particular part of the course or something specific that my team might have experienced. But you all have seen literally thousands of experiences between the two of you in terms of following these different teams and their adventures through nationals. So an amazing event. All right, I have a final question for each of you. So Steph, we'll start with you. So I alluded to this at the beginning. Steph is currently kind of our official, I don't know if we have an official title, Steph, but like a coordinator of sorts for the national championship. And she works very closely with our executive director, Mike Garrison, to then coordinate with the local race directors to put on this great event. The rest of the USARA board is separate from this effort, partly because some of us actually still race and compete in the competition. So we want to make sure that we are not involved in the conversations. So Steph, my question to you is looking in the magic ball, shaking the magic 8 ball, however you want to prognosticate. What are your thoughts on nationals in the future? Are there any conversations, or do you have any private, dreams of how nationals can evolve further in the future over the next handful of years? Or do you think we're kind of at a good place where, other than, of course, the local idiosyncrasies that will continue to shape each individual race, those aside, we have a good model, et cetera? What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the subjects that has come up the last year, 2 years that I think is worthy of continuing discussion is a potential transition to pack rafts instead of canoes. Like most things, it's got its ups and its downs. Really, the two primary drivers behind wanting to think about that transition in terms of racer experiences, the fact that it really opens up a lot more possibilities for course design, and there's certainly a big preference among racers for expedition style courses and an expedition type experience, and having pack rafts can help a lot with that. It just gives the race director a lot more options in terms of where you can put people. And then also the problem with just sourcing canoes, as you've both alluded to, trying to source canoes, let alone canoes that are similar for the number of teams we've got, has become, close to an impossible task. So, it may become a necessity at some point, regardless of the course design. But, we all agree that if we're going to use pack rafts, we want it to be meaningful, and we want the course to be suited to, we want to be using them for their intended purpose. One of the drawbacks goes back to the team count, right? Trying to have 3 team members in pack rafts is not very elegant. You end up with 2 and 1, or, whatever. So who knows? Maybe we go back to 4-person teams and have 2 tandem pack rafts. That's a lesson Troy would say we've already learned. Don't repeat my mistakes. So that's the first thing that comes to mind in terms of the course, and, a conversation that I think we need to keep going. In terms of my vision for nationals, a few things come to mind. I want nationals to be the event in the U.S. that people want to go to, sort of the don't miss event for adventure racers in the U.S., and so I wanted to have a festival atmosphere. I want us to get more sponsors back on board to improve, the racer experience. I would like for it to be an event that people bring more family members to. We still have very few people who bring their family on race weekend. And I would love for it to be an event where, people come early and stay late, and they bring their family and they're there to cheer them along, and they get to enjoy some scenery before or after the event. So I'd like to figure out ways that we can make it more appealing for people to bring family. Something we're doing this year that I'm super excited about, our media coverage is going to be phenomenal this year. So, that's not just a future sort of vision or dream, but that's going to be a reality this year. We've assembled a media team that's going to be amazing, and our coverage for nationals is going to be spectacular. And then lastly, I want to see more diversity in nationals the same way I want to see more diversity in the sport. So, one of the things with the success of the Women of AR campaign, it's also sort of highlighted for me the lack of racial diversity in our sport. And so that's sort of next on my list of things that I want to try to tackle and see what we can do to try to help bring adventure racing to more people of color generally. And then, if we do that, we'll see them come to nationals.
All right, Troy, you started this whole thing. Wow. Closing in on 30 years, or 27 or 26 or 27 years. But USARA is, has been around now for more than 25 years. Nationals has been around for basically 25 years. You get the final word. Any final thoughts on the history of nationals that you feel like you want to share with our listeners today?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to correct you. It wasn't just me that started it. We've always had a bunch of great board members, and we never could have done all the stuff we did without all those guys. From the beginning to the middle to now, it's always been a team effort, and there's just a ton of characters throughout the years that had great influence and great ideas and helped. And sometimes we had bad ideas, or I had a bad idea and they turned me the other direction. And so I always loved all of our board members. I think that they probably didn't get the recognition they should have, and they just did a lot to help grow the sport and grow nationals. I love it, man. I'm feel blessed that I was in the right place at the right time. Somehow stumbled on adventure racing, got to race for years and years, and got to put on races and got to help put on nationals. All of that are, awesome memories that I always have, and just got to see the joy of teams at nationals, and sometimes the agony, but to see them back the next year ready to go again. And, all of that is memories that I'll always cherish. And I'm thankful that I got to play a little part in that. I love to see the sport flourishing. I like the numbers that you guys are having at nationals this year. It puts a huge smile on my face. It's so encouraging to hear that. And I hope first hope to be alive in 25 years. And I hope that the numbers are twice as big then, that we hear the sport, that some other guys have taken it on and keep it going. So I would encourage anyone that's listening that hadn't been to nationals to go. It's a different experience. It's super cool. You're going to meet teams from all over the country, and you're going to have a great course and a really fun time. So I would tell people, put that on your bucket list to do it, and just wish everyone that is doing it good luck, and keep it up, man. Keep chasing those adventures, no matter what they are.
Well, thank you to you both. I'll echo that last final thought. I've done, probably somewhere about 125, 130 adventure races in my racing career, and nationals is my single favorite event, regardless of who's directing it. And it is because of where we started, right? It's the community. It is the single best community event that the United States offers every single year. Some of the maybe one or two of the ARWS events get kind of a similar field of, people from all over the sport who are, represent a big family. But even a lot of those big races, they're much more regional races than they are national. So there's nothing like nationals in terms of bringing everything together for the United States racing scene. So I believe there's still a couple of spots open. I think we were sold out and a couple spots opened up. Steph is nodding. So if anyone's listening to this and thinking about it, you can jump onto the website and sign up. We're excited about this year's event in West Virginia. Like I said, I don't know the details, but I know Michelle and Liz, who are the race directors this year. They run Adventure Addicts Racing out of Virginia. They are absolutely phenomenal race directors, put on some of my very, very favorite events, and some of the most creative, interesting, strategic events out there. So I think we very likely will have one of our very best nationals ever this year in West Virginia. So I encourage everyone to sign up. Troy, best of luck to you with all of the grinding and U.S. endurance. Steph, good luck to you continuing to work with Michelle and Liz and the team on nationals. And thank you both for, sharing a bit of your time and memories about the history of the USARA National Championship.
Thank you. Y'all keep it going.
Thanks a lot,
Troy.
Brent.